The philosophy of Plato that he develops in the first half of the 4th century BC in classical Athens was provoked, we might say, by an epistemological crisis. That is to say that it's provoked by a crisis of belief. How can we know that what we believe is true? And it's a crisis that originates around the philosophical movement of the Sophists, a philosophical movement in 5th century Athens that's characterized by individuals like Protagoras, who come to Athens and ask fundamental questions about what is true. How do we know if our moral beliefs are actually valid knowledge? How can we distinguish what's true objectively or naturally and what's simply our cultural belief? And they ask these kinds of questions, and it is a kind of question that can undermine traditional values, traditional beliefs. It can be unsettling for a society. And we've looked at the different ways that individual thinkers and philosophers responded to this epistemological crisis. Episteme is a Greek word meaning knowledge. Epistemological means about knowledge. And the Sophists provoke this kind of crisis. The plays of Sophocles, especially the Antigone, is one kind of response. It says that traditional beliefs about the gods is a solid ground, that it's a legitimate foundation for knowledge. And we've seen in the play how Antigone grounds her actions, in fact her disobedience of the decree of Creon, on traditional divine law. She says that I'm obeying the laws of Zeus. And Sophocles in the play is in fact warning against the Sophist challenge to traditional belief. But that defense wasn't enough, it wasn't sufficient, and the philosophers of Athens would realize that it was insufficient. Socrates, in a sense, is one kind of response, a life of questioning. Socrates spends his whole life questioning Athenians about the nature of their beliefs. Why do you believe what you believe? Why do you live your life the way you do? Socrates, maybe the most influential philosopher of all time, however, says that he knows nothing. And in fact, up until the moment of his death, Socrates claims to know nothing. It's a radical, it's a profound and provocative claim to say, I know nothing. But in fact, it reflects the intellectual honesty of Socrates to say that it's very difficult to ground beliefs in validity, to say what is the difference between what I happen to believe and what is actually valid, what is legitimate, what is true knowledge. Plato's philosophical system is an effort to respond to the Sophists and go beyond Socrates and to say that it is possible to ground belief in validity, to say that there is such a thing as truth. And he says that Sophocles' account of tradition is insufficient. And in fact, Plato is willing to scuttle almost the entire Greek tradition, especially traditional Greek religion. It's one of the most amazing things about Plato's philosophical system, is that he says that the traditional Greek poets like Homer and Hesiod are liars. And in Plato's ideal world, there wouldn't be these sorts of legends about the Greek gods that most Greeks held to. Plato is willing to say those stories about the gods are simply true. They're no more than mere tradition, and that's not a valid ground for belief. Plato says, in fact, it's quite amazing. He uses his reason to say that gods aren't like the gods that are described in Homer. Those gods are petty, they're jealous, they're very human-like in their foibles and their sins. The true God is one. He's transcendent. He's objective. He's good. And Plato, through the use of his reason, comes to the idea that God is somehow eternal, immutable, and perfect. It's an idea, in fact, that would echo through the ages and become highly influential in Christianity. But how does Plato get to this sort of belief? What is it for Plato that says, this isn't just my belief, this is actually true, this is valid knowledge? Plato believes that it's the use of reason. In fact, Plato comes to believe in an extreme form of epistemology, in which the human use of the mind's faculty to reason is the only basis for knowledge. Plato says that tradition isn't enough, that the Sophists have won the first round of battle. But he's able to build on Socrates and say that we actually can go beyond Socrates' kind of permanent state of questioning and begin to establish valid beliefs through the pursuit of reason. And to do so, Plato is willing almost entirely to discount the value of empirical observation, of sensory perception. Plato is willing to doubt the kinds of information that we receive through our physical perceptions of the world around us, are not a valid grounds for any kind of belief. Plato adheres to a strictly rationalist type of mental pursuit of that which is true. And this kind of epistemology, Plato begins to debut in his great book, The Republic, which is in fact an account, a dialogue of what justice is. But it includes some of the most famous philosophical reflections on the nature of knowledge in all of the Western philosophical tradition. And above all, in one very famous passage, a passage that's known as the Allegory of the Cave. In this beautiful allegory, Socrates, who's speaking for Plato in the Republic, says that the nature of human existence is like a person who's chained at the bottom of a cave, and they don't even know that they're chained. Somewhere behind them is a fire, and there are people who are holding up little puppets in front of the fire. Why there are these cruel people playing puppets in front of the fire, he doesn't say. But he says life is like this. You're chained, and all you can see are the shadows on the wall that are reflected on the wall of the cave. And you see the shadows of these puppets dancing. And that's what you perceive through your senses. And you think it's reality because it's all that you know. Plato says that's what it's like to be a human, to exist in the body and to receive sensory perceptions. You have no way of knowing that what you perceive through your senses is actually true. It could all be false. It could all be an illusion, no different than shadows dancing on the wall of a cave. But he says the philosopher is one who uses his reason to break through the chains and is almost dragged out of the cave by his reason into the light of day. And he says this can be a painful process, that the sun can burn your eyes and that it can take them time to adjust. But eventually the philosopher will come to observe the pure, true light of the sun and realize that all he had perceived before was in fact false. It's a beautiful allegory for what it means to use your reason, to distrust your senses entirely, and to come to a true understanding of the nature of the world. This is Plato's epistemology that places all of its faith in reason and none in sensory perception. And Plato believes that only those who are philosophers, those who truly love wisdom, will come to this understanding of reality. Now, the most remarkable thing about Plato's Republic is that he says that the ideal state should be ruled by these kinds of philosophers. He says that no human state will attain justice until philosophers are kings or kings are philosophers. And so Plato's Republic, his utopia, is a kind of society that's led by philosophers who distrust the senses of the world around them and seek after an eternal and unchanging truth.